Good evening, everybody. My name's Andrew Frost, and this is my guest, Brook Andrew. We're going to talk a little bit about the Biennale, about the theme of the Biennale, and Brook's work in it, and maybe some of the works that you've got planned that are coming up in the next few months. But I'd be interested to know from an artist who is participating in the Biennale, what's your take on the theme?
Well, I think it was a way in which, politically incorrect. I think that's kind of my theme. I mean, it's very much about, including perspectives that are not the normal kind of European Western notion of art, and that's, it can be seen because there are a lot of works in the exhibition from the Caribbean that kind of do address different ideas of representation, but also a kind of a murkiness of maybe spirituality and connection. But I think that when I say politically incorrectness, it's kind of like all that kind of murky area that sometimes I think people don't dare to go. And I find that really inspiring because it's about growth and creativity.
That part of the title, The Beauty of Distance, of course, conjures up the tyranny of distance, something that has a lot of resonance for Australian audiences. Did you react to that in any way?
I love romance. It's a bit of tyranny of distance, It's like when your lover goes away and you can't see them. I don't know. It's also the beauty of distance. I suppose as Australians, we have conflicting notions about what that means because we live in the Asia Pacific region. Yet our country is so vast and complex as well. And even my own identity is complex. In Ngunnawal, Wiradjuri, Scottish, Irish as well. So we're all informed in very different ways. And so the ideas of, the tyranny of distance, beauty, etc., I think speaks to us differently. But yeah, I think it's good for an international biennale to deal with these issues, especially in the Pacific, because if we look at the way in which Europe imagines Australia, and the Pacific, it is very much about second thought sometimes.
One of the things that struck me about the works that I've seen so far in the Biennale is there seems to be an emphasis on a kind of handmade folk art element to the work, which sits very interestingly with some of the more technological works such as video installations and so on. But the works run the gamut of forms and media, just about everything that you can think of. Are there any works within the Biennale that had particular resonance for you?
Well, in regards to that and form, I really love Michaela Dwyer's work. I always have. And I think that there's a real intuitive element in regards to connecting object with space and a site-specific kind of reaction. And of course painters do that as well. And of course, the site of Cockatoo Island itself is kind of a bit like that. This kind of jumbling of history of buildings and objects that come together, and then when you put art with that as well, or people like Michaela who work like that, it certainly does make you question the kind of traditional way in which, that can be seen, and breaks down the barriers a little bit. Like for Dale Frank's works out there, you normally see them, these beautiful kind of, paintings. They're very slick and you may, kind of expect to see them more in a white space. So it's quite challenging, I think, to see them in different space like that.
It is also, I guess, there's a chance that the Cockatoo Island is such an impressive and amazing place architecturally. There's so much history, there's so many layers of history that the works could potentially get lost in the space. And it's really interesting to see how some of the artists have dealt with that. One of the works that had a big impact on me was Peter Hennessy's My Hubble sculpture, which is a full-scale replica in plywood of the Hubble Space Telescope, and it has a set of stairs at the back which you climb, and then there's a very tiny little telescope at the end, and you peer through it, and at the bottom of the sculpture is just a piece of plywood with glitter sparkled on a black paint. And so you get this sense of the enormity of the thing, but also the kind of handmade, ad hoc quality of it. And we were talking yesterday about some of the other pieces that you responded to, and one of them was a New Zealand artist named Fiona Partington, who has a suite of photographs at the MCA. Could you describe what those photographs are and what the connection was for you, what your reaction was?
Yeah, I mean, they're busts. I mean, most people here have probably seen the work at the MCA, and they're busts that have been photographed. So, I mean, I think they're all death masks, and of Maori people and Pacific Island people and Europeans, and from the 19th century. So, at first, I kind of thought that they were made up from people today, and was a comment on that history of documenting people through death masks. Because a lot of the work that I do in museums looks at representation, and I was kind of and how we present that. So I was kind of interested, but I'm pretty sure they were images of actual death masks. And the things that I love about that work is, you know, we have in museums a documentation of Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples, and there's a hierarchy. But when you put them all out together, they're all death masks. And so there are ways in which you can actually get into that. I want to say status, you know, into that. I suppose it is a status, you know, of culture and marking and what that signifies in museums and class and Darwinism, etc., anthropology. Yeah, there's a crack in there, you know, and I think it's just pure representation. So if you kind of represent European next to, you know, Islander people, etc., you just see it for what it is.
When you say you're talking about the representation of museums, are you talking about the way in which those kinds of things are presented as a visual experience, or as a kind of value hierarchy in the way in which they're displayed?
I mean, it's such a complex history, the curiosity of Indigenous people, the way in which the people were collected and traded throughout the world, not only through human remains, but also cultural objects and artefacts, that today it's kind of really, yeah, I think it's, you know, a complicated history. And when I was in Europe for an exhibition I did called Theme Park, it was specifically looking at the representation of Indigenous objects and people in those museums, and the way in which that they're given a particular status, but also how they're kind of rendered invisible as well. So when I talk about those kind of histories and representation, it's about, well, we have that, but we also have, that's a glass. You know, this might be filled with water, that might be filled with milk. I mean, for me, it's about looking at the object as it is and trying to break down the kind of the history which has been built up about that, and the representation which has been built up around that, and empower them all equally. And so with her photographs, I felt that, and I was trying to work it out. It was like a jigsaw puzzle. And I thought maybe she's tricking us, you know, maybe that they're contemporary masks of her family even, because I think she's Scottish and Maori. I think, I mean, I'll have to check that. But, you know, and so, you know, there's kind of a really interesting kind of comment, which kept me guessing. And, yeah, it kind of breaks down those barriers and the kind of things that I'm interested in.
The works have a great presence.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that they're kind of like big memorials, you know, they're kind of like the busts that you see around in our parks in Hyde Park, but they're not visible. So you come to a place, you know, like the Biennale, where David Elliott's gone, okay, it's the tyranny of distance and beauty. It's like, well, where is that tyranny? And I think tyranny is kind of really an interesting word.
One of the other artists who you mentioned, I think, is also from New Zealand, Shane Cotton. What was it about that work that touched you, that had some kind of connection? Was it along similar lines?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's about the head, and it's about the face and the body, and the kind of way in which I suppose some Pacific Islander cultures really look at that and muku and you know, and that kind of representation, and how empowering that is for them. And I think that that's something that within our own communities, it's still a very touchy kind of subject, and because it is very complicated for so many different reasons, and so these are the kind of areas that I'm very interested in. Yeah.
And by contrast, I think it's the work of Kent Monkman, an artist from Canada whose work is very humorous, but sort of touches on, I guess, a theme that Partington and Shane Cotton's work is connected to. I mean, they're very humorous pieces, but what else is in there?
I don't know, I just like the feather boas and the drag and it's kind of fun. And I think that we kind of forget to have fun within our own cultures, and it's really important to empower that aspect of it. And have this sweeping, beautiful, kind of landscapes. But of course, that's kind of a comment about coming in and painting these, colonised lands in new ways, which are for a different gaze and a different eye. And he's kind of inserted these kind of really contemporary figures, and so that's kind of an obvious kind of contemporary look at two-spirited people and the way in which that they function in contemporary society, and I think that there's a lot of fun in that.
Now we should really talk about your work that's in the Biennale. What is the title and what is it referring to?
Well, it's the Jumping Castle War Memorial, and I apologise if you're not allowed to jump anymore. I don't know if you've been out there and seen it. But, yeah, I mean, I suppose it's a war memorial. I think there are war memorials that are lacking for people who are forgotten, or people who have experienced, or their families have experienced great grief or loss. I was speaking with a PNG Solomon Island woman the other day, and she was telling me about her family and her father being involved with the Japanese invasion of the Solomon Islands and PNG, and telling me her story. And she told me, she was saying to me how important that jumping castle is for her. And so, really, in my research, I've been looking at the disappeared of South America. Christian Boltanski, for example, a French artist who looks at the Second World War. So, I'm really quite interested in how other artists from around the globe look at representation in regards to the loss that are not part of a dominant discourse or a dominant war memorial or culture. And of course, that's something that I felt quite passionate about in regards to our own histories here in Australia, and how we kind of make links to these places overseas that are not kind of in a fixed cultural position here in Australia, which is often quite difficult to talk about. And so I really wanted to give it a big breath, and so connecting up that, making it kind of more like an international war memorial for those who aren't forgotten. Yeah.
It sets up a very interesting dialogue between the form of the piece, in that it is a jumping castle, but also by appending it to this war memorial, to this remembrance. I guess, some people might think that you're somehow making fun of it. And the other aspect of it, which is so interesting to me, is that you have to be 16 years or over to jump. Why?
Well, mothers were giving me hell, I can tell you. Well, firstly, these issues are difficult, and I think that in Australia we know, and people come from Australia or other countries, we know the kind of complex issues surrounding ideas of talking about identity and history and culture in this country, and it's a minefield, and rightfully so. And it is a farce, and it is ironic that we don't have important memorials here in this country in regards to colonisation and invasion, and also that relate to place and time. So, in the 70s and the 80s, lands were being taken away in remote areas, etc. So, it's a very long, complex history in Australia. So, I'm very interested in how that's not being dealt with, and why can't it be a jumping castle? I think there's an irony in that, and my work's never easy. It's about the turmoil, it's about the complexity, it's about the sort of things that over the years Australians sometimes don't like to talk about. And it's like, well, okay, go on, talk about this.
But the question of participation, of whether you choose to jump or not jump, and the fact that you have to be at the age of consent to consent.
Yeah, it was
jump.
actually 18 years old, but then we lowered it to 16 years old. It's about consciousness. It's about actually making a conscious decision to actually get on there and make these decisions about how we engage in an Australian identity, how we engage in history, how do we take responsibility for our own ancestry that we have inherited. And I say that because one of my best mates is a Syrian from Iran, and he came out here when he was 2 years old. He's my age now, and his father came out finally as an asylum seeker 10 years ago, but he never told me that until a few years ago. And then he was having an issue with his father wanting support from him, but he didn't want to support his father. So these are kind of complex issues about place, about support, about the way in which we have issues about asylum seekers in this country, how that is a race debate. These are kind of meaty, kind of interesting issues that I think that people have to be conscious to make decisions about. I think we have to kind of step up and make the mark. And it's not about a dirty word. I think that to be able to engage kind of in issues and ideas which provoke polemics and provoke discussion is an important part of any healthy society. And if we're not having those healthy discussions, I think that, well, I do know that there is a lot of problem, and it's not just here. The work I'm making for the Sherman Foundation, which opens in July, is another blow-up. So it's 13 by 7 metres and 3 metres high. And you put on a costume with a pattern on it. So you put on this costume and you crawl in a tunnel at one end. So it's like this, for example, and you crawl in a tunnel here, but it's big and long. And then you go into a room. And so you're actually like in a womb, and it's a bit kind of scary, I think. I know I'm just imagining it, but yeah, so that it's called The Cell. And I really wanted to create a space where you could be anonymous or you could be yourself. And, there's that kind of psychological play, I think, and physical play. Mm.
I'm still very curious about this question of interactivity, because you've moved out of a sphere of presenting a work to the public for the public to actually interact with it in a very physical way. What prompted you to sort of start exploring this aspect of
inviting
your
people
work?
into my world, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that art is very much about looking at pictures on walls, and and filmmaking is about inviting you into someone's world, and you're actually moved by. I am, one of those people that gets incredibly moved by film, and I go home and in the film world, and I think that for the issues that I wanted to kind of talk about, or were becoming more visceral, or they were becoming more personal. And so I'm thinking, okay, I want to go on a journey. I would love it if people went on that journey. So it's like inviting someone for some food or a glass of wine, and you know what I mean. You kind of end up being in this new space. And people need to make a choice and make a decision about that, because it is an unknown thing. I mean, you've got to cross the line. So with the Jumping Castle War Memorial, it's about, okay, got to cross that line, and if you're jumping, what does that mean? And also with The Cell, I mean, if you put the costume on and you're crawling through the tunnel, are you actually going to make it in there? Like, you don't know how you're going to react. You're going to be claustrophobic, you're going to think you're going to be fine, but you're not going to be fine. It's about kind of being put into situations, I think, that really are kind of unsafe in a way, or ways that maybe you have an unconscious kind of reaction to. Mm.
So you're embracing an element of risk then?
Absolutely. Yeah.
I was curious about how much involvement you had with the siting of the work on Cockatoo. Did you have a choice as to where it was placed and how it was oriented and so forth? And if you did, what was the significance of its siting?
Well, we're kind of crossing up between the Botanical Gardens and Cockatoo Island, and I kind of felt like the Botanical Gardens were a bit too pretty. I mean, I liked it, but it's a bit pretty. And so the Cockatoo Island, it was going to be a little bit more on the apron, so you had like the harbour bridge in the background, but it's a high wind risk area. But also where it is placed now, it is like a traditional war memorial. It's fantastic. It's actually, it's high, it's lifted. It's got like a little kind of grassy knoll thing, which could be a pool of water. And then you've got these kind of like concrete, the bottoms of columns almost, kind of running down either side. So it has got a procession. So it's worked out perfectly.
Yes, it almost looks as though it was made for that space.
It was made a long time ago for that space.
So do you feel as though that you're sort of leaving behind your previous work in terms of this new direction?
An artistic dilemma. I don't know. I mean, I just kind of... there are all kind of sorts of issues in regards to representation and how we see the world that I'm really interested in. And my museum research will always continue. But I think increasingly so, I'm very much more interested in spaces which create or change people in some way.
You've exhibited in Europe, and I was curious as to whether you found that your work had a different reaction in a different social context, and whether the kinds of things that you were touching on and the sorts of themes that you were interested in had a different resonance for those audiences.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was very specific about the show as well.
Well, you were saying before that this piece is going to go on tour.
Oh, do you mean the Jumping Castle?
Yeah. Will it be going overseas, for instance?
No doubt it will. I'm not sure where, but it's going to 10 Days on the Island and up to Queensland Museum Art Gallery as well. I mean, I'd like to show the cell and the Jumping Castle, and also, I've also made 2 large blow-up clowns and also lots of costumes. I'd like to kind of send a circus kind of theme park troupe, on its way, where people walk into this site and put on the costumes and, you kind of become part of this theme park. I'd really like that to happen. I think that would cause a dilemma.
I mean, one of the things that we were discussing earlier was, I guess, a question of appropriateness or decorum in the way in which certain things are exhibited in, especially natural history and anthropological museums, for instance, and the kinds of issues that surround the display of artefacts and human remains, for example. And quite a bit of the work that you've been making has touched on those issues, and I know that they interest you. But I guess my question about how your work plays internationally what goes to the idea that perhaps in Europe the consciousness about those kinds of issues is different.
I mean, I think that, the tourism industry has had a huge impact. Stereotypes can be kitsch and funny, but they're quite serious in regards to the impact on international visitors, etc., and histories. And we can't forget that, for example, in Holland, where I've exhibited major shows, they've got their own history of colonisation, and in Indonesia, etc. So I think that perceptions of indigenous cultures, unless you're actually in a colonised place like Australia, for example, South Africa, they're quite different, and people's mindsets are quite formal. I mean, they are still here in this society, I think, because it's almost like you can't have a mixed identity, regardless what you are, or if it's more to do with an indigenous identity, it's kind of a little bit hard to kind of roll it over in your head. But if you're Italian, Scottish, it's okay. Yes, I think tourism. I mean, I think that these kind of stereotypes play a hard kind of case in regards to representation, because especially our $2 coin, they're kind of representations about one specific country in Australia. So when you're an artist and that you do touch on issues of representation, obviously, for an overseas audience, they're going to think one thing. But I mean, it's not to say that it's only confined to just artists like myself. I mean, if you're a woman artist and you've got a picture of a body, everyone's going to think that, it's a very particular issue about talking about the woman's body or something like that, when in actual fact it might have nothing to do with it. But I think that's in kind of most areas, I think.
What do you think it is that is so confusing about mixed identity, about that kind of representation?
I think that it's about the Darwinian leftovers that Aboriginal people were seen as the most primitive people on the planet, and so the way in which that they documented our ancestors was the way in which the Nazis documented, those people who they slaughtered, and so they thought we were just going to drop away, etc. And so I think that there are issues about, and it's still those kind of that kind of mentality, I think, is still very strong in this country and around the world as well. And so there were experiments performed on people that were government funded to breed out the genes in the blood, etc. So these are very much part of our social fabric, regardless if we have a kind of a consciousness about that or not. And so that goes on to the way in which, for example, like you were talking about, the way in which objects are displayed even. The way in which certain objects are displayed in museums. You have to walk through. I mean, I know there's been a lot of debate even in the Art Gallery in New South Wales about where do we position First Nation people's objects, Originally it was down under there, and then now it's down there, and now they're mixing with the European art here. So it's about how we position identity and what comes first and what comes second, what comes third on the Richter scale. And don't forget, I was at the Royal Anthropological Institute in London once, and I've done quite a lot of research, photographic research there, and there were a set of photographs. An anthropologist from the 19th century had done skulls, and it had your London aristocratic person was up here, but your London prostitute was next to Aboriginal and African skulls. So really it was about class as well as Indigenous identity and the kind of way in which that was put on the scale. And I think that that's not long ago. We're not talking about 500 years ago. So I think that these are things that are very much still part of story. Mm.
Well, I probably have another 20 questions for you, but we're actually out of time. Okay. Please join me in thanking Brook. It was a fantastic talk. Thank you.